Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to start a new part of our webinar series. We've been doing a number of webinars since I guess the country's been going in and out of lockdowns, just to share ideas, keep everyone interested and engaged with what we're doing here at Pest IT, but also just to look at different specialised areas of both what we do as a business, but also what our colleagues are out there doing in the Australian pest marketplace. So since July, or since June, I should say, we've had a number of webinars. They've all now been uploaded on our YouTube page and our socials. But today is something a little different. I'm actually focusing on a particular pest. It's a seasonal process that we work with seagulls or silver gulls in particular. And we're going to just look at specific pests all throughout the rest of the year. So while today we'll talk about silver gulls, next week or the week after we'll look at another pest, and probably pigeons, and then just work our way through our various bird species, and then look at the different ways that we work with them, how we manage those processes, and work with our clients to find solutions. So looking at just sharing a screen with you now, and this will just take a second. And the idea of today is that just focusing a little bit more on just a particular pest. It just helps us, just helps us share more ideas. It actually makes me research into a pest that I might have worked with for a decade or two, or in this case 3. And so by doing this process, I'm actually learning more as I go along, some of the specific and interesting and some of the scientific elements of the different species just helps extend where I'm at as well. So today we're going to look at the silver gull, and the silver gulls for me is an interesting pest because I have been a resident of Sydney and northern New South Wales for almost my entire life. And for many years, I'd come down to Melbourne and see the impacts of this particular bird species being significantly greater than I would see in other parts of Australia. Now, in the last 5 years living in Melbourne and working with my team here, and in particular with Josh, seeing just the different techniques that are used for bird management in this part of Australia, it just adds to, I guess, my interest in this particular bird, but also just the overall processes of how we deal with various bird species right throughout the course of Australia. Okay, so today our discussion, well, we're going to look at these are the discussion points that we're going to look at with all the bird species or all the insect species. We're going to look at obviously the names, the common names, scientific names, how we identify that species, what are some similar species, the pest status of that particular species. In the case of silver gulls, we'll look at the legal restrictions as we would do with all dealing with wildlife, or when we're dealing with a protected species or a native species. We'll look at the distribution of the bird throughout Australia, its behaviour, its obviously preference in food, and welcome Damien, just how you going there, sitting in your office, and the impact that this particular bird has as a pest species, and in particular for those of you that are joining us from other parts of Australia, and Damien's just logged in from Brisbane, we'll share with you just the impact of this particular species in southern Australia. How it behaves and how they nest is completely different in Melbourne and in Tasmania as they do in New South Wales and Brisbane. So then we'll also look at the impact, not just of this species as a pest species, but then we'll look at the management options. And then Josh is going to join me for some of the areas of his specialty in working with silver gulls. All right, so this is also a brief snapshot before we go into greater detail. But here, this will be forming part of the notes that I share with you after today. We've actually got a relatively large bird. It stands at 45 centimetres high. The nice thing about this particular bird is they're just as happy in the built environment as they are in their natural environment. So unlike pigeons and other birds that really focus their attention on feeding in our environment, these birds do also, but they're very comfortable in their natural environment, so they have a longer lifespan. And perhaps because there's less intense pressure to go to the same roost each night, they actually tend to be more gregarious or more colonial in how they congregate, and they actually will and therefore have a longer lifespan. Food we'll talk about shortly. Their habitat, well, of course, the built environment is their preferred area, and we'll see a lot of that during the course of this discussion. From a nesting perspective, well, this is a bird that would previously nest in grasslands, and particularly on outer islands or islands in bayside, in the bays of both Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne and so on. And we'll talk about that and their breeding cycle. Well, this is when we start having a lot of impacts with silver gulls in Southern Australia. They're breeding in May to October, and that's when our phone starts to ring here. And it's quite interesting to sit back and watch. So look at the names. Now, the interesting thing is this the scientific name of the silver gull, it was Larus novae hollandiae. And the interesting thing is, now I can't pronounce this, so we can all have a laugh when I try to. Cryococephalus novae hollandiae is the new scientific term. And so there's been a new genus to separate all the Larus into large and small species, and so the small to medium species sit in this new genus. So silver gulls is our common name, but they often get called gulls, seagulls, and probably numerous other derogatory terms as well. So identifying the silver gull, it's kind of interesting because it's a small gull. It's our most common gull in Australia. And the interesting thing I'd ask is I thought they were called dimorphic, but actually they're monomorphic. So monomorphic means that the male and female are virtually indistinguishable. And of course, on our left-hand side, we've got a adult silver gull, and on the right-hand side, we've got a juvenile. And so we'll see the darker bill and darker legs and mottling on the wings. But essentially, being a monomorphic species, the male and female essentially look the same. But of course, it does have some similar species. So there's, again, in southern Australia, we have two other gull species, but they're significantly larger. They look a lot different. On the left, we have what's known as the the Pacific gull, I should say, and on the right-hand side, with a silver gull there as well, is what's known as the Pacific gull. Sorry, the kelp gull. I get them mixed up. Good thing we're not talking about them today. But certainly when you're down here around Tasmania and Melbourne, Port Melbourne, and out in East Gippsland, you'll see the kelp gull particularly. And when you see them together, startling difference in size. So silver gulls, I guess they're pest status. I seem to have lost pest status. We know in Australia that they are a significant pest. They're Australia's most common seagull. And being a native species will determine how we deal with this bird in what you'd call a pest situation. And so thinking about the legal restrictions associated with dealing with this bird, well, they are protected in every state of Australia, being a native species. Not only the birds, obviously the young adults, whatever it might be, but also the nests and the eggs are considered protected. There can be no lethal control or population management unless there's certain circumstances that authorities, excuse me for a sec, authorities allow that to be the case. And so in Victoria, you would be contacting DELWIP, and in other states, you might be contacting either National Parks and Wildlife or other associated authorities. Previously in Victoria, there were opportunities to use lethal control, and that seems to have changed dramatically in the last decade. Distribution-wise, well, we are talking about Australia's most common seagull. In fact, while they've been traditionally restricted to coastal areas, we found now that with, I guess, the population growth of us in the human sense, and this bird's ability or interest in our built environment, you now see not only birds nesting in what has been less than traditional areas, they're now inhabiting all throughout Australia. And so with Australia having amazing inland, not seas, but inland lakes and waterways, but also sewerage works and other areas where external water is available, we've seen this bird inhabit right throughout the country. So from a behavioural perspective, these birds are colonial nesters. So they will nest in large colonies In most cases, in what you would call the natural environment, this bird will head towards offshore islands. And so in Victoria, there are islands all throughout Port Phillip Bay. There are also islands right throughout the coast heading up north. And what you'll find as we're heading into May, the birds will congregate in these islands. What then occurs, just purely because of the sheer numbers of these birds, that all the nesting locations get taken up, and therefore the birds start to look towards nesting in more of what we will call the built environment. And so the built environment, I'm referring to our buildings, and seagulls are actually nesting on roofs right throughout Melbourne, and Melbourne itself is one of about 17 or so cities around the world where this behaviour takes place. And so what happens is when the natural environment is taken over by predators, and so on the mainland of Australia, certainly in southern Australia, we have significant fox colonies, and foxes being a predator to all ground nesting birds, you'll find that silver gulls, having nested and taken up all the offshore grasslands, will then obviously head onshore, in which case head to flat roofs. So what we find here in Melbourne is that anywhere with flat roofs or air conditioning systems or box gutters, you'll find anywhere up to hundreds and sometimes thousands of seagulls nesting and roosting on these roof areas. Not only are they sort of convenient, getting away from human activity and intervention of predators, wintertime in Melbourne tends to be pretty cool, and so the roofs are offering radiant warmth, and that is a major improvement to their ability or ease of managing successful broods of young. Distribution, we're going backwards, let's go forwards. Okay, nesting. So as I said earlier about protection of both the adults and young, and also the nests. The nests, what we find on roof areas in Melbourne generally tends to be on flat roofs and in box gutters and around air conditioning systems. Anything that will just hold the nesting material in place. They're nesting twice a year between May and October. And so each successful brooding tends to be around 2 to 3 eggs with an incubation period of about 28 days. And in a fledging period where the young are starting to take flight, tends to be about the same time, between 18 and 24 days. So food-wise, well, we know that seagulls are pretty not particular about what they're going to be eating. They're scavengers. They'll spend most of their time around the tips and transfer stations, around built-up areas. Their natural food obviously tends to be aquatic or coastal, but of course, now that they're living and feeding in our built environment, they'll look at whatever human food waste that's available. And of course, the favourite hot chip being the most preferred, and so therefore you'll see a lot of seagulls heading around there, the coastal areas for that. But if you're venturing into transfer stations or tip faces or landfill, I should say, you'll see hundreds or somewhat thousands of seagulls. An important element that I haven't mentioned so far in terms of distribution, and certainly that's the case here in Melbourne, this is a bird that also needs to drink fresh water. Unlike some of your seabirds that can drink salt water, these birds drink fresh water. And therefore, sometimes you look at the distribution of seagulls around Melbourne will often link in with industrial areas, the super tip sites, but also natural streams going in. And that's why we see you've got Mary Creek and areas around Epping becoming an issue with seagulls. But certainly when we look at Frankston, there's a natural waterway going into Port Phillip there, and that is one of the primary sources of significant nesting rookeries for silver gulls here in Melbourne. So impacts of a pest species. Well, we can see here on the right, we can see what a nesting rookery starts to look like. You've got a lot of dirt and debris, you've got droppings, you've got lots of birds, and when you've got that, you've also got carcasses. So with that nesting material, you'll also have lots of bones and all the material that the birds regurgitate. So they've been feeding throughout the course of the day, and like gluttonous sort of feeders. They come back to their roosting point of a night to digest their food, and often they'll regurgitate the excess that isn't required, and bones and other bits and pieces tends to be that. So a nesting site's going to be smelly, dirty. The impact on the building is significant. So what we do find is that buildings that are holding a colony of hundreds and sometimes thousands of birds, you'll see a major deterioration in the guttering. The guttering will corrode relatively quickly, but even the roof itself. So the roof will tend to be lasting about 50% of its expected life cycle. So a roof on an industrial site's meant to last about 50 years. And just because of the intense corrosion of the droppings, you'll see that reduced by half. In fact, a colleague of mine by the name of Ian Temby did a tremendous PhD on the impacts of seagulls in the built environment here in Melbourne. And it's an interesting read, but also some of those impacts are far reaching. And so we find that here in Melbourne, over the last decade, the number of seagulls has not only increased dramatically, but their area of distribution or the location of these nesting rookeries has really expanded with just the availability of food and the sheer numbers of birds themselves. Okay, here's an example of a photograph I took on a roof when I first moved down to Melbourne, and I hadn't seen this number of seagulls. So here I'm not seeing any seagulls, but after they'd taken off, that was just the droppings that were just left on the roof itself. And this wasn't even a major issue. But then when you have a close look, you can see the deterioration and the corrosion that is caused by the droppings. But as you'll also see on the right-hand side, the carcasses. So when you've got bones, carcasses, and nesting material, and a reasonable downpour of rain, that all heads towards the gutters. Gutters clog, get overflow, incursion of water into the building itself, and a significant mess and damage. But of course, then we look at the damage of someone that might drive into an area and you've got a few seagulls, but if you're leaving the car on the right for an extended period of time and you've got a lot of birds in that particular area, the damage caused to car Duco should be significant. The interesting thing, of course, is when we look at the bird species, there's only one exit hole when a bird is depositing its droppings. And so, of course, you've got the uric acid of the urine, the solids of the droppings itself, all coming out at once. So from a management and looking at our solutions when it comes to dealing with silver gulls, I'm going to invite Josh Martin, who can join me here. But so when we look at management solutions, hey Josh.
Good afternoon, everyone.
When we're looking at managing seagulls, what we find actually on our right is something that Josh is going to talk about in a moment when we get onto some slides. But what have we got happening here?
Elevated roof netting. So what we've got here in the photo, you've got 50 mil AVE Pro Deluxe netting. And I believe from this photo, that installation had 2 meter galvanized poles.
Sure.
Those galvanized poles are spaced out in a 10 meter grid. You don't want to space this out any further because then your net's going to sag. This actual installation was quite large. I believe it was about 90 meters by about 50 meters down in Port Melbourne. Yeah. And as you can see in the center of the photo, there's I'm guessing it's a chiller unit for air conditioning. Underneath that, there was about 4 different nests, and there was about 20 of those on this roof. Yeah. 2 of them had failed, and they had to get them craned out. So this is exactly the perfect scenario as to why we do elevated roof netting.
Yeah. So that was a car yard too. So the idea is that when you've got a lot of birds, it's not only impacting the roof, but it's impacting all the way around the roof, and of course cars and people getting hooked on.
And it was BMW of all cars too. So there you go.
Cool. So let's just touch on a brief element of the management options, and then we'll press on. So I guess when birds are congregating on roofs, we're going to look at, I guess, grid wire, which is probably not our preferred option, but grid wire is often used in what you call a light pressure situation. But once the birds are nesting, we're going to head towards something like elevated netting, like Josh just mentioned. But in in between all of that, you've got a whole bunch of options. So bird shocks or spikes could be of some value, and we'll look at that. Sound system, again, not an area that we work in. We like to sort of look at, I guess, be it professional or scientifically backed systems. So we probably will look at alternatives if we're looking at scare deterrence. And so we would look at visual deterrent systems. And then I guess like any pest related situation, it's not just about the product solution. It's about the overall look of the process. And I guess what I meant to say is you're looking at cultural changes and hygiene changes. So from a cultural changes, we're trying to control the food and the water, or we might be able to modify both the bins of how they're with lids, or how you change the intervals of sanitation and so on. So there's a whole area to be considered there, and that would be the same in all of your IPM approaches. All right, okay, so bird shock. I might just start here, Josh. So bird shock, this is an example where you'd find a situation where your birds aren't generally nesting in large numbers. So a light to medium pressure situation, great when we're using a product with a really high deterrence value, but I would say bird shock's not really suitable for a nesting rookery. I know this because I tried. And so what we did once with a significant nesting rookery, we used bird shock around intervals, both on the roof ridges and the parapets and leading edges and so on. And we were able to deter the silver gulls off that particular roof. But on the roof, either side of that was unprotected. And what we did realize after a while is that silver gulls spend a lot of time in the air, and when they're depositing their droppings directly onto the track itself, over time the track's going to be overwhelmed, it's damaged and wrecked. And so that track had to be taken off every 3 months, cleaned, and then reinstalled, and that's not ideal. So of course, in a normal situation, you'll have the birds shocked and leave, and that would be a great result. And this is an example of just a nice, easy installation. The traditional landing points are literally proofed with an electric shock device, and that would be sufficient. And bird shock's been such a great and reliable product, but there are instances where it's just not suitable. Bird spikes. What do you want to share us with bird spikes?
I hate them.
Yeah.
That's just me. As you can see on the screen, ideal in your light pressure situations. Sometimes when we do our elevated roof netting, we will put bird spikes on the leading edge. Sometimes we even put shock track. Bird spikes are just great for the the down pipes or the main leading edges of just basic stuff. I don't mind them. I don't hate them. Yeah. We've got two different types of spike too, and we generally use all stainless. So, yeah. I mean, silver gulls can still land on the spikes at the end of the day too. Yeah. So, and we've seen that before. We have a couple of photos. Well, so,
but I guess bird spikes, I think if we look at bird spikes as being edge protection, then that's going to be useful, because the interesting thing is, well, you've got a bird that's 45 centimeters high. They've got a wingspan of 75 centimeters. I think I said meters, but anyway. But the thing is, this bird will hover on the spike, and so there are brands of spikes that are 100 millimeters high, 150 millimeters high. It doesn't matter; they will still land and even nest on the spike. So here we've got an example of just good edge protection. But again, you can see up the top photo, seagull just sitting in amongst what is a very densely populated bird spike and still not being suitable. So yeah. All right, elevated bird netting. This is your favorite area of what we do.
This is definitely my niche. It's this photo here is on top of a government building, I think in rural Victoria, multiple levels too. I think by the end of it there was about 6 different levels. We use a different type of pole here, but still all the same. It's still galvanized and the like. But what you can't see from this photo is that we didn't just follow 10-meter grids. It actually curved in 10-meter grids as well, which is a bit interesting. This was for seagulls and for your pigeons as well. So 50 mil netting again with all stainless steel cable, brackets, the works. This was a very lengthy process. I think it was about 3 weeks. Yeah, very good project too. I mean, elevated roof netting, we use custom poles. I've had clients who have asked for 1.2 meter poles for residential installations, which is fine. Our average is about 2.2 meters, and I stand 2 meters tall. I like to have a bit more room to sort of move around. That's the average, 2.2 meters. Now, those poles we get custom made here as well. We've got a great supplier down the road who puts them together. They're galvanized, they're welded, and then they're hot dipped again for extra durability. It's fantastic. We custom made those quite some time ago, and they've withstood the
test of time.
Test of time. There you go. With any AVE Pro Deluxe netting, carries a 10-year warranty, so 19 mil or 50 mil. And I'll just touch on that too. You can use 19 mil in these installations. Generally for Seagulls, it's 50 mil. But we have sometimes used 19 mil for smaller birds. We've had that issue before. As you can see, 50 mil, perfect for Seagulls.
So a 50 mil net too is you've got less wind resistance, less visual impact. It's lighter. So I guess you get that durability and so on. So yeah, cool. Some more photos. Talk us through those.
So the photo on the left is the same car dealership that was in Port Melbourne. That was, looking down the lengthways of it. Again, you can see one of the units that obviously had the seagulls nesting underneath it. On the right, again, is the rural, I believe that's the rural Victoria job we did in 2016. I actually visited that site just recently to replace some zip, which had been, it was plastic zip. Butchered
contractors.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Went back and spent a day there repairing the zip. But those poles, that cabling system, the netting, fantastic condition. I was very surprised by the poles too.
Oh, they're pretty strong.
Very strong poles. But the netting, there was barely any sag in it, which was great to see. And Pete was right about the wind resistance with the 19 mil net. The 50 mil, you don't get that anywhere near as much. So
yeah. Cool.
Beautiful.
All right. This is a job that I did. So this is netting, and not necessarily elevated netting, but you'll often find this is in Frankston. Dandenong. But both of those areas, if we think about Melbourne, and apart from Don, most of the people here that I can see are from other parts of Australia. But we have a couple of traditionally intense seagull populations. I mean, it's all the one population essentially, but you've got Port Melbourne, you've got Frankston, which was one of those real traditional major issues with seagulls. In fact, when I went first down to Frankston, somebody said, can you come and do a site visit down there? This is going back before you joined us, but 5 or 6 years ago. I thought it was a war zone. I've never seen anything like it, to be what I would consider a bird person, to go down to Frankston and just see the hodgepodge of different systems that are in place, but just to see not just the sheer numbers of birds, but the impacts that they have on the retail and wholesale businesses there. And actually looking at some of the people that are here with us today, there's like, I was thinking that Damien, one day, Damien, I'd love you to come down to Melbourne and I'd take you just to Frankston and just go and have a beer or a pizza or something down there just to see what bird management's all about, because we all like to think that we're bird people, but until you go and have a look at that. Anyway, I digress. Back to this job here in Dandenong. This was a really simple, nice, neat job. One day, I was just showing my mate Ron on the right-hand side there. But the idea is that this is just a simple air conditioning plant room that just needed netting over the top. So it's just a one-day job. Most of it you could do from either standing on either side, or in this case, occasional ladder use on the inside, but you're just going around the outside with a stainless steel cable, netting over the top, compressor there with air gun, and away you go, complete the whole process nice and quickly. What could have been done there, which wasn't, which was later done, a couple of eagle eyes either side to then stop the birds from sitting either on the netting or just around the perimeter. But one of the things that we find, obviously, when you've got large numbers of birds congregating around your air conditioning plant room, you've got air exchange from the outside to the inside, and it's a very unsafe and unhygienic situation, particularly for those people in the building. So truly important when you look at some of the impacts there of birds impacting people in office blocks and so on. Air conditioning plant room. There you go.
And what we're also finding is, I don't know about you, Pete, but I've seen in the last, I've been here for 6 years, 5 or 6 years now, is seagulls are coming more inland than they are hanging around the bays. I just had a client come through, or customer come through, wanting to get a quote for elevated roof netting on a residential house, and that was like in Diamond Creek. Diamond Creek is inland; it's nowhere near the bay, so we're tending to see those Seagulls move inland as well.
Yeah. So just I forgot to mention that. So that's the before shot of the installation. We started. We've got cabling going around the perimeter there, and then netting just over the top. Nice and neat job, really quick and very simple. Okay, from another perspective of seagulls impacting either commercial sector or domestic.
Solar panel exclusion. If there's one thing I can say about solar panel exclusion, when you install it, it butchers your hands. Fantastic product though. We've been selling this quite frequently, haven't we?
Well, it's also why we put gloves.
That's in the very box true. Now. In the box you'll find there's actually gloves now, which is fantastic. But these two installations are fantastic. Yep. On the left, the corner cut and how it's just cable tied looks absolutely fantastic, and that it doesn't move, does it? It's that rigid, the stainless steel mesh. The clips are fantastic too, with two different types of securing systems. So you've got your little flat washer that holds it on there, and then your spin nut just to hold it on for extra durability. Fantastic. Yeah.
I guess one of the important things to remember, I guess more so with pigeons, but also with seagulls, and I'm sure some of you that are here today will probably have already come across this, is just by putting in solar exclusion doesn't necessarily mean by excluding a bird from its roost that they'll miraculously leave. And sometimes it's a two-stage approach. One, it's the primary process will be to exclude the birds from under the panels. You'll see obviously a greater reduction of the damage, both of the panels and of the roof. But the birds, particularly because they've been nesting there, might not necessarily leave immediately and may not leave at all, may even continue to try and nest through another winter, which is actually saying something down here in Melbourne. So a second stage deterrent system like a visual deterrent was probably going to be needed.
Easy to install. I mean, our 30-meter kits probably take, on average, single story roof, half a day to install. No drilling required. And this was the main, I think this is probably one of the main reasons we brought this product in, is because there are certain businesses going around that were drilling and screwing the mesh into the solar panel. Now the homeowner wouldn't know that the minute that you do that, it voids the warranty. So no drilling required. You won't void the solar panel warranty. And the stainless steel mesh, again, fantastic warranty of 10 years.
Yep, cool. One of the deterrent systems that we introduced into Australia back in 2008, now it's got quite a bit of track record, is Eagle Eye. Now, Eagle Eye as a visual deterrent has been really useful, particularly for silver gulls. There's a red Eagle Eye for silver gulls. One of the important things to remember, because often people try to mention that Eagle Eyes might not have worked for them. The interesting thing about Eagle Eye that we found, and having a lot of track record with this particular product, and with that, like a lot of deterrent systems, you have the positives and the negatives. The thing that we have to remember with Eagle Eye is that we're deterring birds from open spaces, which is the most difficult thing to do in the world of bird control. But the second thing is we're deterring birds from airspace. And so birds, once they land on a building, they will not be deterred by Eagle Eye. So it'll often look embarrassing when you see birds sitting next to your Eagle Eye. That's never good. But the important thing is that you're protecting airspace around a building. And so often what we found, particularly like Frankston and Dandenong and places like that, when you try and do part of the building, the birds can still land on other parts of the building and walk in. And, we've got Don and Damien and other termite guys here. The example that I say with bird management is if you treat half the house for termites, you're not necessarily, and probably more than likely, not going to get the result you're looking for. And Eagle Eye is one of those examples. It's a whole building approach. So on the right-hand side, there's an interesting job. You've been out for this one, and I remember doing it very some time ago, apart from being on the Pong, being at a human waste treatment plant. But the red Eagle Eyes early on did actually a tremendous job of deterring the birds off those gantry walkways.
They did. That's true.
Here's an example. This is an interesting photo. It's not perfect, but what it does do is on the bottom left hand of our screen, we've got an Eagle Eye with a light, and it's deterring birds away from this particular boat. It's actually not deterring birds off the entire jetty or jetties. And that's an example where birds will sit in the blind spot of the Eagle Eye. But what this is doing is keeping birds off the immediate area. and a number of 2 or an entire approach would give you the result you're looking for. All right, I just took the snapshot of a job I scoped out for a client just the other day. He wanted to know, we've got seagulls congregating on the front of the roof. I said, naturally, we'll do the entire roof, but he just said, look, just give me an idea of what to use at the front. And so Peter, so is the red for larger birds only? Oh, thanks, Damien. I'll be one sec. So what this image here shows is we've got the eagle eye reds and then eagle eye solar units or eagle eye wind units. So solar units will give us movement all the time when the sun is out, and then the wind units, well, in this location it's always windy, and so the idea is that each unit is designed to cancel out the blind spot of the other unit, and so hence the whole building approach. Now, Damien, your question. So, Peter, is the red for larger birds only? We use the red eagle eyes for 2 reasons. One, they're primarily designed for marine birds, and so for whatever reason, the guys at Eagle Eye had determined that the red spectrum of light, or the light that's reflected from the red unit, tend to give off some sort of greater deterrence factor to silver gulls or seagulls, cormorants, ducks and other aquatic birds. That was just from their research. Second of all, we use it when we have areas of intense flashing off the silver unit causing problems, be it with traffic or people in their offices or universities. So often it's an extra shield that goes on a silver unit, but often there's been the changeover from the red tinted units for the silver units for less intense flashes. Hopefully that answered your question. All right, so here's a classic install on a rooftop with, there's quite a few red units used on this particular area. So while in the foreground, I can see a red wind-driven unit, and that's the old red wind-driven unit. They now have a bird breezer on top. So that actually creates the ability to spin. And in the background, you'll see another couple of units on the peaks, and then that links in with a few other units. So the idea is you're trying to get just a broad deterrence by having other units in a line of sight to each other. All right. What do you see here?
Bird breezer.
Yeah.
Now, I have to admit, I'm privy to some information on this product.
Okay.
We've had it here, and it's been quite popular.
Sorry.
From my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, because you always teach me new things on a daily basis, but this is to be used in addition to Eagle Eye Powered, isn't it? It's not just you can use it as use it as a standalone unit, say for instance, a residential situation, but it has nowhere near the same coverage area. So you use that in conjunction with your 240 volt or your solar kits, sometimes wind as well. So
normally you'd use your standard Eagle Eye about every 30 meters. So it actually has a 25 meter radius. So you're getting some deterrence left and right, up to 50 meters, and then your other units link in. The bird breezer only 2 to 3 meters either side. So bird breezer, for me, I reckon it's great that you would use it if you're doing a solar system. So it's $150, $160 item. So you might put a couple of those in on a solar array when you're doing your solar exclusion, but they can be also used often when we're scoping out for pest control clients to put in Eagle Eye. We'll suggest to put bird breezer or another product called Propeller in amongst it. But again, it's just a lot faster flashing, less intense. Anything that's going to do 2 things: create movement on the roof and also different spectrums of this reflective light. So the interesting thing about reflective light, it's not just probably what we see. I think the birds do see something else. One, it's distracting while they're flying, but I think birds can see different spectrums of light that might mean something else to them compared to what just the actual flash means to us. All right, platform protection. Sometimes we get seagulls just in a small confined area, and so products like Huntsman or Daddy Longlegs, or there's other brands called Spider. The 2 I mentioned actually rotate around in the wind, or when the bird approaches, the wind from theirs is sort of setting the thing off, you know, so it looks like a spider. So on the left-hand side, we see a lot of daddy long legs used on a roof. You would have probably put some poles up there and netted over it.
Pretty much.
And on the right-hand side, we can see someone's just mounted a daddy long legs on a brick. That's going to stay there. It's really important that the legs or the tentacles of the system protrude over the edge. So as the bird finds its way to the little landing point, the whole thing starts to move. So daddy long legs can still be quite useful. Which one of these would be best for pigeons, and which would neighbours get annoyed?
Neighbours get annoyed.
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Damien. The interesting thing is, one of the impacts of eagle eyes is the flashes are deterring the birds, but they can have an impact. So if it's deterring the birds for a 25-metre radius, obviously it's more powerful than the unit that's actually got the 2 to 3 metre radius. And so the one thing about the bird breezes is they're a different type. It's not as an intense flash. It has nowhere near the range. So we've had some instances recently, actually up on the Gold Coast, a pest manager put in solar exclusion, and in the canals put eagle eyes on, and the intense flashing created some intense complaints. And so they came off. They would have worked, but sometimes you're just changing the behavior of the birds. So to actually get those birds moving off and probably nesting elsewhere, maybe that's also a success. So there's little different ways to look at that. And then just thinking about silver gulls again, they're going to find a favourite place to digest their food, get warmth, and there's no better place in Melbourne than on that spot there. And then the example would be daddy long legs or a huntsman just on there would fix that. So would spikes, but spikes tends to also create complaints from members of the public when you've got webbed feet birds. So I guess when you've got pelicans, silver gulls, cormorants, it just seems to have a greater range of impact associated with complaints.
And they don't look as good as the daddy long legs. The daddy long legs, you sort of look at and you go, ooh, you don't really understand what it is, but you see bird spike and you go, ooh.
Yeah, it sort of looks like some sort of alien communication
device. That's right.
All right. Now, the product we developed and mucked around with a bit's called AVE Pro ElectroBird. And when you come up with names like ElectroBird, you can tell I'm not very good at coming up with names. But look, on the left-hand side, you can just see that this is a grid system that's also a hot wire grid system. And so when we've got intense populations, but in a confined space, we might not be able to net over the top. We could just run a hot wire around the parapet. But in this case, this was just a hot wire system right across a roof. And so it's kind of like an insulated process. And then we just link the whole thing together with a solar panel. And that's a great way just to really keep birds off a confined area. Wouldn't use it in large spaces, but areas where you've got some visual impacts associated with elevated netting. But there are a number of reasons to use this particular product.
Residential rooftops, for instance, small, like new developments up in Wallet, up north of Melbourne, for instance, Pakenham and the such. Yeah, definitely.
So that's just around a parapet, or if you can see on the right-hand side, so it's a grainy photo, but we can see just birds were congregating at the front of this particular area. So the pest operator just literally just sort of put in several of the electrified rows as a grid, and it kept the birds off from that perspective. So there's a close-up photo. It's an interesting product that really works. All right, so we're just sort of finishing off now, thinking about products. If you're also wanting to look into the webinars that we've been running, well, this one's on seagulls. Just recently we did one on just a variety of bird management products, like just taking into the whole scope of bird control. If you've got new team members to your company, last month we did an introduction to bird management, and a lot of the things that I'm speaking about with all these different presentations tend to link back to that. There's other ones up on rodent sensor technology and a bunch of other topics. What we will be doing is actually conducting a couple more interviews that'll be interesting for pest managers over the next couple of weeks. Next week, I'm particularly excited about is about preparing your business for acquisition. And so that's an interesting one, because we all just get into business. We all do what we're doing. We're all hopefully making money, or at least covering our wages. But the idea is that at some point we need an exit plan as we grow old. And so the idea is that is just an interesting discussion for all of us, young or old, to have a firm exit strategy in place. And that will be an interesting one to talk about. The week after, I've got Vasily. We're going to talk about all things AEPMA, and AEPMA, I guess, essentially is the voice of our industry. And so I've got lots of questions to ask him about how things went, or how things are going in COVID, and what can we expect from the association in the years to come. All right, so just finishing up, one, I'd just like to say thank you. We've had questions through this process, but if you've got any questions either now or afterwards, I'm happy to help in any way. During today's discussion, we touched on silver gulls, our identification, similar species. Being a protected species, we really need to just be careful how we interact with this particular bird. In different parts of Australia, you'll have dealing with wildlife permits and different levels of leniency of what you have available to you. Being an Australia-wide bird, we talked about its distribution and behaviour. Hot chips, they love, not too hot, and with chicken salt. Yes, we have discussed that here in the office. The impact of the bird species and how we deal with this bird is different all the way around Australia. And so if you're ever really interested in understanding what birds can do in their extreme, so often we talk about bird pressure being light, medium, and heavy. Well, silver gulls have created their own little category called extreme. And when you've got 10,000 seagulls nesting on your roof, all of a sudden your skylights are black and you can no longer see, and your roof is really just falling to bits. So that's extreme. So the impact can be significant, and we discuss some of the management options, which of course is our favorite part of our business. So just finishing up there, I am going to welcome us back. There we are, there we are. So hi everyone. So thanks for being with us today. We're going to continue doing these webinars regularly, and if this is an opportunity to get you more involved in them, Josh, well, then we'll do that. But that's about all we had to say. So happy?
I'm happy.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks very much, everyone. And we'll see you all again soon.